It's my pleasure to chair the Q&A in this this part of the proceedings, but also to encourage you that this isn't necessarily just a case of posing questions to the panelists, although you're most welcome to do so. It is also a place where, if you wish to contribute an insight or to say something, that you can raise your hand and do so as well. So we want to make sure that there is some dialogue aspect to this as well. Now, while the film was playing, there was a question in the chat, which was really helpful. And I'm going to turn maybe first to Shona to ask her about defining nature and what do we put under this category of nature. And you'll recognise that this is a terrible question, but it's one, if you like, as a basis from which we might be able to open out the conversation a little bit. So Shona, you're not to define it, but you are to maybe give us some boundaries and some themes within which we can think about that further. Over to you.
Oh, thanks, Jan. Hi, everyone. Hi, Kathy. Thank you for your question. It's wonderful to see everyone and to have the opportunity to go define nature. No, that's too challenging. So in thinking about, I guess, drawing on one of the themes that the earlier panel drew on about thinking through the history of environmental accounting literature, I think nature has been something that's a number of people have debated in the field and comes through in the chapters as well. So the first thing I would say is no one definition. I'd say that over time we've environmental accounting has maybe looked at environmental concerns of pollution and then as a result of that considered stakeholder responsibilities. But the work that has struck me most powerfully around thinking about nature and the work that accounting can do in this area is that of Ruth Hines and Christine Cooper in the early 90s. And to me, that was so powerful in thinking through accounting as a productive force in defining what is to be included as nature worth accounting for and being accountable for, and that to be externalized and perhaps ignored or made less visible. So that would be maybe first off is to say, please go back and look at Ruth Hines and Christine Cooper's work on the challenges and early debates about this topic, and it's unfolded over time. And I would suggest there's a series of themes around nature that have been considered since then around maybe ecological concerns, animal rights, so the work of Aya and Matthias Lane there. But more recently, I think there's been a shift away from the organisational entity to look at particular species, and I'm thinking of the work of Jill Atkins there, or also landscape, so looking at Clément, but also the work of Tom Cookston, and Colin and I did some work on rivers as well. So I think we've got another trend of shifting away from organisational entities to those that we may be drawing on geography and environmental management catchment scales. So that would be one other theme. But what has received less attention maybe is around genetic resources, and so drilling down into micro level rather than stepping out to a landscape scale. But another area that I think is worth pursuing, moving away from a spatial scale, is to think about the temporal scale and how that may shape the way we think about accounting and accountability. And that's something that I think, I know Brendan had mentioned earlier about geography, and that's a discipline that I often read and I'm inspired by. And Kathy, you mentioned in your note there that you're from a geography background. So I think there's lots of promising avenues to pursue there in terms of drawing on geography's insights around scale, space, time and place, which is something that would definitely inform future work in and around nature. So I've avoided the definition aspect of it, but have identified a series of other people's works or themes that I think we've touched on there. And now I'll hand over to my colleagues, Rob and Clément, who might be on the call to offer more definitive points about nature whilst I mute myself.
I'm not sure I have some definitive answers, Shona, but I do have an answer. This question is very important, and I think what is fantastic about accounting is that accounting is about defining categories and counting or representing things based on these categories. And so the question of the definition of nature and how you then account for it is absolutely central, especially also in biodiversity and ecosystems. And the evil is in the details when it comes to accounting. And so most of the work today in academic, but mostly also gray literature, when you talk about natural capital accounting, is actually about measuring the value of ecosystem services, for instance. And so to say nature has value because it provides services and contributions to society, let's say. And when it is this idea that at first was being developed to be to encourage or to advocate for the need to protect nature, but when this idea becomes embodied within financial accounting frameworks, for instance, then it can lead to consequences that actually consider that a company needs to protect nature only because it provides services to it. Some other accounting models, I'm thinking of the CARE model, for instance, that has been developed by Jacques Richard and Alexandre Rambaud, and that we work on in the ecological chair of accounting. The notion, the definition of nature in this model is nature is a debt that a company or an organization has to repay as it uses ecosystems to create value. It needs to budget costs to then repair the ecosystem based on ecological conservation targets. So that's another definition of nature, completely another definition of natural capital that leads to completely different financial accounting suggestions about how to integrate nature within companies. And so you can see that concepts, techniques, and accounting lead to very, very different situations.
Thank you. And just before I pass over to Robert, I can almost see you drawing breath, Robert, so sorry about that. There's another chapter, I think, that in the handbook that helps us, and this is chapter 15, which is from Catherine Christ, Stefan Schultager, and Roger Burrett. And they look at materials and energy accounting within the management accounting sort of part of the handbook. So there's something in there as well, if we're thinking about an account for nature, beyond living nature, there's a movement of materials and resources in ways that might have impact on the biosphere as well as themselves moving, you know, maybe polluting, but also moving through their system. I mean, it's not, I don't want to sort of delay it, but it's that materials and energy conversation in the handbook sort of links across to your work, Rob, and looking at carbon and climate accounting as well. But I will now stop on that segue and pass over to you, Robert. But keep your questions coming. Oh, there's things in here. That's cool.
Yeah, I think I was taking a deep breath, Jan, because how to define nature is a question I've been trying to avoid for the past 10 years, really. It came up in most of my presentations during the first 2 years of my PhD. So I don't really have too much to add to what Shona and Clement said as well, because I think they're absolutely spot on. Perhaps I'll keep it brief then, and the only thing I'll say is, I suppose, maybe this links more to, particularly to some of Clement's points, is I think it relates to what is it that you're interested in about nature? What are you interested in? What an accounting form of quantification does to nature, the way it classifies, the way that it tries to put some form of numbering system to certain aspects of nature. If that's what you're interested in, you might be looking for definitions that are more suitable to that line of inquiry. Yeah, so I don't have anything close to a reasonable definition, and I wouldn't be brave. I'm not brave enough to venture one for carbon accounting usually, let alone for nature. So I'll leave it at that, Jan. I have to say Clement and Shona covered it quite well.
Ian's whispering other questions I should ask you, but I shan't. So there's an interesting question in the chat as well about extinction accounting and the extent to which we might think about either the extinction of species or the destruction of species habitats. And I'm pretty sure Tom's on the call somewhere as well. So do think about what you might want to say in the space as well, Tom, because I know that you've got good views on this. The one thing I might say is a sort of preliminary, because in the seafood industry, we're looking at species, endangered species, as well as broader environmental impacts. So I think there is a sense in which species extinction is the terrible end of overexploitation of nature, but it is, if you like, it's eye-catching, but it's perhaps not as widespread as what accounting and biodiversity might be, in terms of even if you are interfering with natural flows, or you're simplifying food chains or trophic cascades or whatever. These are also important alongside, if you like, the really nasty hard end, which is the extinction of species. So there is a continuum in there, if you like, and there's been quite a bit of work on extinction accounting. Jill being a very good example of that. But I wouldn't like that focus to draw away from all the rest of the sort of the issues that are in play in this broader set of things. So I think it's a very important but particular subset of the total. And indeed, there's a new paper out in Journal of Business Ethics about live sheep exports from Australia to the Middle East. And that is absolutely replete with the kind of questions and issues that are within, that final section of the handbook, but also in and around the conversations today. But I also want to open up to Tom if he's still here and wishes to do so, but also anyone else from the panel or any other contributors in addressing this question about how Anthropocene and accounting literature helps discuss reporting on biodiversity or the extinction of endangered species, or indeed talking around that issue in general.
It's a very timely question, as there has just been by the end of last week the opening of the IUCN Congress in Marseille, where they have established species extinction lists, an endangered species list for decades now. So it's a very timely question, as they are currently negotiating actually the new list. I might not look at this question from the same angle as those who are working on extinction accounting as part of extra financial reporting process of companies. Well, in my work, the way I look at it is more about how you organize collective action to tackle the extinction of a species. For instance, we've done some work in Indonesia around the question of protecting orangutan habitats in situations that are very complex and conflictual, etc., etc. And the question here, the way I approach this question of species extinctions in my work, at least, is to look at the species as the center of the accounting process, and to try to understand how different accounts can help different actors that are in interaction with one another to tackle or to organize the management and the protection of the species in situations where other people and other actors are actually trying to do completely other things out of this landscape that would be very detrimental for the orangutan. So you have, in some ways, different accounting plans or accounting territories that are being developed. One accounting territory that is being centered in some way on protecting the orangutan and creating alliances among actors that are working on that, and some others, palm oil accounting, who are doing other kind of alliances, allocating other kind of values to the landscape, and are making the orangutan completely invisible. And I think it's important to recognize that the question of species extinction is always entangled within these contested and conflictual spaces. So that's my personal answer to that. But thank you for the question.
Jan, do you mind if I follow up? Come on. So I think one brief note as well is, if you go back to some of the panel, I talk about 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees as global targets on climate change. And one thing I mentioned is that hides a lot of discussion. And one thing that it hides is that one part of that debate on the levels of warming that are associated with sort of risks to unique and threatened systems. So I suppose in that sense, when you're talking about extinction, the 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees targets are linked to debates around that, but because they're simple targets, they kind of hide a lot of the complexity that underpins it. So if you look through the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, they usually have these thermometers across, I think it's normally 5 different areas of impact, one of which is unique and threatened systems. So it's almost implied that some of that debate around extinction is embedded within those targets. It's just not something people commonly talk about, is the issue.
It's brilliant. Thank you for that, Robert. And that's a really nice example of a connection between biodiversity and carbon as well. So returning to the person who asked the question, do you feel you're brave enough to turn your mic on and say, why have you interested in focusing on extinction specifically, and what insights you might have after that conversation among various people on the panel? Where's it taken your thinking to?
Thank you. Good morning, Professor. I'm Ujjwal Mondal from Bangladesh. I just completed my Master of Research from University of Dundee. And during my study, I searched for topics for my incoming PhD. So I found some research from Professor Jill Atkins, who is researching in this topic, actually, the extinction accounting. And then I found that it is very interesting. And personally, I'm very much motivated to do research in this area. That's why I want to learn something. But I studied your paper also in the Anthropocene in accounting literature, but I'm not clear about this thing. So I'm struggling to draw a framework for my study. That's why I asked this question, actually.
I think the thing I would say that maybe where the Anthropocene comes in, the Anthropocene is our current moment in time where human behaviour is a large driver of environmental change. One element of that environmental change is global climate change, but then another element of that is species extinction as well, and the distribution of species around the planet in different ways, and the destabilization of webs. So these two things are linking together. If you like, the Anthropocene might be the overarching concept within which other things happen, of which one of them would be extinction of species as part of that, and functional ecosystems. I see there's another question in the chat. You see, we're getting the hang of the questions in the chat business. So I don't know if you can see it, Rob, because it's sort of directed, quite as a carbon question. So Rani is asking about carbon accounting and traceability. And in particular, she notes that from the handbook in chapter 26, carbon invites accounting scholars to engage with international climate governance. Is the global stocktake of the Paris Agreement, and I would say COP26 coming up as well, also something that will be interesting for accounting scholars to engage with? What will be your perspective between standardization and flexibility in accounting for collective progress on mitigation, adaptation, and finance?
I think, Rob, we want to redefine nature now.
yeah, you can go back to redefining nature.
That's right. Yeah,
it might be easier.
You go for it, Rob.
I mean, obviously, question from Rainey is always going to be difficult, as this one is, and very perceptive too. So talking about the global stocktake of the Paris Agreement, I think is probably one of the most important things that we could look at. And as a bit of background, essentially, with the Paris Agreement, one of the core mechanisms is asking for nations to pledge what they're willing to commit to submit their plans to the United Nations. But the core mechanism is that every 5 years, they have to propose an updated plan. And it's the idea that they can become more ambitious every 5 years. So the global stocktake is a way of, it is a taking stock of all of those different plans that have been resubmitted to see what level of warming we're aiming for, what level of ambition we've achieved in policymaking. And I think in that regard, yes, the global stocktake is incredibly, to me, it would be interesting to me as an accounting scholar, I suppose. I mean, on the one hand, stocktake is a beautiful metaphor drawn from accounting in some regards. And on the other hand, simply as a core mechanism within the Paris Agreement, it's it's going to be an incredibly important thing that we scrutinize. But this is where Rainey's question also picks up on a nuance within that as well, which is the plans that are submitted. There's not necessarily a standardization about how those plans should be communicated. There's a lot of flexibility given to individual nations to decide what their plans should look like, what targets they're going to aim for, what metrics are going to be monitored. And at the heart of that is the importance of national sovereignty, the idea that the United Nations shouldn't be telling nations around the world what to do, can roughly form consensus on what we're trying to achieve, but not telling people what to do. So in that regard, what's the perspective on standardization and flexibility? Well, I would say flexibility is at the core of this, because it's about allowing nations, giving people, respecting national sovereignty and saying the plans have to be from the nations to decide how they're going to tackle climate change, how they're going to adapt to it and finance those matters. The issue then becomes, how do you take stock at an aggregated level again if everyone has communicated it in a different way? And I would suggest there, instead of trying to standardize these nationally determined contributions, these plans and the metrics that need to be communicated, instead it would be to create a meta standard again of how can you translate all of those different commitments into a global figure. So it would be about creating some kind of, to Jan's point around boundary objects, something connecting all of these different plans and pledges together to create that global view. So I'd say that at the heart of the Paris Agreement is the flexibility that respects national sovereignty, and that's what makes it quite different from the Kyoto Protocol. But I'll stop there because I'm about to digress into a whole nother area.
Where I might digress before I invite you, Rani, as to whether or not you want to respond to that at all, is this whole national sovereignty and then governing by objectives, but allowing countries to choose how they deliver the commonly held objectives is exactly what's underlying the Sustainable Development Goals as well. So that idea that you might be able to, sketch pathways and make agreement on pathways for all countries to reduce carbon or to tackle, biodiversity or poverty or whatever, is now gone from the international policy making arena. And so what's in its place is this idea of, partnerships for the goals, multilateral bodies trying to help countries, work together, and organisations and industries and countries and industries work together to achieve these commonly agreed outcomes. So it's the real politic of where we are, and in some ways you might lament that because there's so much flexibility in it. But on the other hand, it's sort of a kickback after the Copenhagen conference, where poorer countries felt they were being told what they're going to do by richer countries. So in some ways, it's actually, it's a good outcome that countries aren't bullied into here is the list of things that you're going to do because you're a smaller country. So it's a tension between those two outcomes, and we are where we are, and so it's quite a different kind of governance landscape than maybe it was even 5, 6, 7 years ago. Rani.
Thank you so much, Jan and Rob. Yeah, I wouldn't comment anything, but I would like to reflect. Because it's like reflecting on my research as well in some ways. Thank you so much.
Excellent. So before we bring this to a close, I might just sort of, Rob, I'm going to turn to you again. COP26, is it the absolutely critical one? What hopes do you have for that? And if we're looking at COP26 as a sort of like a general citizen of the UK in my case, what am I looking for to know if it's working or not?
Yeah, it's difficult. It's a good question. The different conferences of the parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the different COPs, can all serve quite different purposes. Where you look at Kyoto and Copenhagen and Paris, those three have really been a focal point for reaching some kind of agreement that's going to guide all efforts going forward. In a lot of the other conferences of the parties, you can look to progress being made on individual mechanisms within, and agreeing whether it's certain types of accounting systems that should be used, or around the Kyoto Protocol, the enforcement mechanisms that were designed but never used in the end. So I think one thing that's changed with COPs potentially recently is there's an importance of simply having it as an annual event in climate change to bring all of that focus together into one forum. And I know there's some climate negotiators who said, we have the Paris Agreement, leave it to the work streams now to develop mechanisms. We don't need COPs for the mechanisms anymore necessarily. The point there is it becoming a useful annual focal point for the debate on climate change and pushing things forward? And I think from a UK perspective, we can see the amount of pressure we're able to put on the UK government, for example, to be demonstrating their commitment around it. So to me, this would be very different if I was asked the question 10 years ago, but right now, is this helping the world put pressure on their respective nations to become more ambitious on climate change? Because that's what we need. This core mechanism within the Paris Agreement of increasingly ambitious pledges is not going to be effective if we can't put pressure on our nations, on our governments to become more ambitious over time. So if we can have an annual event like this that becomes a focal point where we can work towards some sort of announcements from governments, to me, that's what would be an indicator that COP26 has been a success. And if you want to get into the technical details of what the discussions are going to be, we can do that as well. But I think to me, COPs serve a different purpose now that we have the Paris Agreement established.